A cop shot at me for daring to wear my military uniform, the uniform I shed blood for, the uniform that cost me friends. He thought a black general was a joke, a ridiculous impossibility, and he tried to erase me from existence as if my life meant nothing. But how I survived and what I did afterward will surprise even those who've seen it all. But let's start from the beginning. The city shimmered before me. I hadn't been here in years, and it wasn't just the appearance of things that had changed. This was not the city I had known, nor were these the people I once recognized. I always imagined that coming home would be a return to what I'd left behind. But now, doubt gnawed at me. What was I expecting? The streets felt empty, though they were crowded. Instead of the pride and gratitude I once thought I'd see in their eyes, I saw only weariness and indifference. Everything had changed, and perhaps most of all, I had. The uniform on me felt heavier than usual. It had always been a symbol of strength, resilience, something bigger than myself. Each medal was a reminder of the battles I'd fought, the comrades who didn't make it back. But here, in these streets, I felt as if I carried it as a burden. The stares of passers-by were distant, indifferent. In the army, I was used to respect. Here it seemed like a far-off, unattainable thing. Sometimes, it felt like the city no longer recognized me. I navigated through the crowd, avoiding eye contact, not seeking answers in their gazes. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was a stranger in the world I fought for. This world was different. Everything felt too quiet, too calm, and it unnerved me. I was searching for something familiar, something that would make me feel at home again. The corner store looked exactly the same as I remembered it. It was the store where I used to buy my favorite cereal as a teenager before joining the service. It was something that anchored me to the past. A simple thing, but for me, it symbolized a normal life. I decided to go in, though I felt a strange tension within myself. Maybe it was just paranoia, or maybe I was no longer the man who could enjoy such simple moments. I quickly found the aisle with the groceries. Everything was as I expected. A familiar store, the same smells, familiar brands on the shelves, and there they were, my cereal. One box left, as if it had been waiting for me. I picked it up, and for a moment, I felt warmth from the simplicity of the act. Nothing had changed. There was still something connecting me to the past. I wanted to head to the register, but suddenly, I felt someone's gaze. Stretching my neck, I saw a cop standing at the entrance. He was staring right at me. A young guy, maybe 30, with a tired look on his face. I immediately knew something was wrong. In the army, we called guys like him trouble on two legs. That look, full of negativity and suspicion, as if I'd already committed a crime I didn't even know about. He approached me too quickly, and I was already bracing for trouble. "Hey, pal, that box is mine," he rasped, as if we weren't arguing about cereal, but something far more critical. At first, I didn't understand what he was talking about. A random cop claiming my cereal? It seemed so absurd that I thought he was joking, but his look said otherwise. "I got to it first," I said calmly, though something inside me began to stir. I didn't want to start a conflict, especially not with a cop, but his tone left me no choice. "Take off the uniform," he suddenly demanded, and his voice was so aggressive that I couldn't believe he was serious. I stood there in my uniform, the symbol of all my accomplishments, my medals glinting in the store's lights. I'd always been proud of what I'd achieved, what I'd been through. But this guy was questioning all of it. "What?" I asked, hoping he'd realize the absurdity of his words. "You don't deserve to wear it. These uniforms are for heroes. And who are you? Just some old man making up war stories." I felt something snap inside me. This uniform was a part of me, and his words cut to the very core of my being. Anger began to rise, but I had to stay calm. Not now. Not here. Inside, I was boiling. I tried to keep my composure, but every word from this guy cut deep. He knew nothing about me, about all I'd been through, yet his words struck like knives. I was on the edge, but I knew that any wrong move could lead to disaster. "You don't know what you're talking about," I said slowly, looking him straight in the eye. I saw contempt and anger in them. This guy was clearly looking for a fight, and I didn't know what had made him so furious, but it obviously wasn't about the uniform or the cereal. "I know enough to see that you're a fraud," he continued, stepping closer to me. "That uniform isn't yours, and if you don't take it off, I'll make you." At that moment, I realized that calm explanations wouldn't help. This guy wasn't interested in listening, and any further discussion would only make things worse. But I had to stay composed. I could still control this situation. "I have every right to wear this uniform," I replied, trying not to raise my voice. "I earned it. Every mark on this uniform is my life." But he wasn't listening anymore. I saw it in his eyes. He had already made his decision, and nothing could stop him. I felt the tension rising, like the calm before the storm. In the army, these moments were always the harbinger of something bad, and I felt the same now. But this wasn't a battlefield, and I was alone. He took another step, and I knew that if I didn't stop him now, things would only get worse. But I couldn't. I had no right to start this fight. I never imagined I could become a victim in civilian life. I was prepared for my life to end on the battlefield, where every day might be my last. But here, in a regular store, on my home soil? Hans stood there, holding a gun aimed straight at me. His hands were shaking slightly, and his wild eyes betrayed him. I knew that look well. I had seen it in enemies who lost control when fear consumed them. Now that same fear, blind and uncontrollable, was directed at me. My uniform, my medals, they all seemed distant and meaningless in the face of this real threat. Hunt thought I was a fraud, a thief, and it didn't matter what I said to him anymore. It was no longer about the box of cereal, no longer about the uniform. He already saw me as the enemy. I stood still, careful not to make any sudden movements. Whenever I faced danger in combat, my mind would slow down, zeroing in on one thing: how to survive. Now, I felt that familiar, calm, cold state spreading through my veins again. It was as if everything around me vanished. Just me and Hunt. Time was running out. I had to act, but any mistake could cost me my life. This cop, someone meant to uphold the law, had turned into a threat I needed to defend myself against. "You seriously think that's your uniform?" Hant said again, his voice trembling, his finger tightening on the trigger. I tried not to focus on the gun, but it was right in front of my eyes. Any move could be fatal. "Hant, listen to me," I said, forcing my voice to stay calm, even though everything inside me was screaming for action. "This is my uniform. I wore it. I fought in it. I'm not your enemy." "You're threatening me," Hant shouted, almost like he was trying to convince himself he had a reason to pull the trigger. His eyes no longer held anything human. I'd seen that look too many times, right before a fight broke out. He fired. The pain in my shoulder hit so suddenly that for a moment I forgot where I was. This wasn't like the battle wounds I could push through. The pain was sharp, instant, like a whip cracking. Blood started trickling down my arm, but I knew that if I didn't act now, this store would become my grave. I dove behind the nearest shelf, toppling over products with a loud crash. Glass shattered, but I didn't care. My mind was on autopilot. I had only one option: defend myself without losing control. My movements were swift, even though my heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might explode from my chest. This wasn't a battlefield, but everything inside me was operating on the rules of war. "You're not getting away!" Hunt screamed, his footsteps closing in. I pulled out my weapon, ready to respond. This wasn't the fight I wanted, but I had no choice. This guy had stopped being a cop. He was now a killer, driven by something only he understood. "Stop!" I shouted, stepping out from my cover. Hant fired again, the bullet whizzing past me, shattering another display case. The entire store was descending into chaos, and I knew this couldn't last much longer. I aimed and fired back, aiming for his leg. War had taught me to avoid unnecessary bloodshed whenever possible. He collapsed, clutching his leg, and I seized the moment to duck behind cover again. My shoulder was burning with pain, but adrenaline kept me afloat. I watched the blood pooling beneath me, but I couldn't afford to stop. Seconds stretched into minutes. The store was in complete disarray. People were screaming, shelves were toppled, glass everywhere, and the sound of gunfire echoed through the aisles. But all of that was just background noise. I focused on Hunt, who was writhing in pain but still trying to aim his gun again. We both knew time was running out. The pain in my shoulder was becoming unbearable, every second bringing a fresh wave of agony. I knew that if I didn't act soon, I'd lose too much blood. My life was hanging by a thread. But I couldn't just shoot him in the head. That would be the end of everything. Killing a cop, even in self-defense, would destroy everything I'd worked for. I wagering to stay human in this nightmare. Hunt lifted his gun again, but I was faster. Another shot, and his gun flew out of his hand. He screamed in pain and fury. I gritted my teeth, pushing through the excruciating burn in my shoulder, and started moving toward the exit. I knew I wouldn't last much longer, but I had to get out of here. My head was ringing, my pulse pounded in my ears, and I was barely able to stay on my feet. My vision blurred, but I heard the distant sound of sirens approaching. Help was on the way, but was it really salvation? I knew this was just the beginning of a new nightmare. Would anyone believe my story? How would I explain that the cop, who was supposed to protect order, had become my greatest threat? When I opened my eyes, the world around me felt like a foggy, surreal picture, as though I were looking through cloudy glass. My eyelids were heavy, and the first thing I felt was the sharp, consuming pain in my shoulder. But that pain was just a reminder that I was still alive, even though I lay in a hospital bed, caught somewhere between life and some other reality. I tried to focus, to gather my thoughts, but every movement of my head sent another wave of pain through me. I heard voices. People were talking nearby. My name was being mentioned, strangely, unnaturally, as though I were someone else. Then I caught the key words. Shooting. Army General. Police officer. That snapped me back to reality like a jolt of electricity. Flashbacks of the incident pierced through the fog. The store, Hunt, his deranged look, the gunshots. I exhaled, realizing it wasn't a dream. I was here, in the hospital, because something unthinkable had happened. A cop had tried to kill me. I listened closely, trying to catch more details. I heard them discussing my case. It was now beyond the city. My story had spread nationwide. Army General, war hero, shot by a police officer in a grocery store. I could hardly believe it, but every word from the news confirmed the grim reality. This wasn't just an incident. It was an explosion, a blow to the entire system, to the country I'd fought for. Despite the pain and the haze clouding my thoughts, I understood that this wasn't the end. Now I would have to fight, not for my life, but for the truth. My second day in the hospital was filled with an endless flow of information. The hospital's televisions broadcasted reports, headlines flashed in my room, and nurses whispered about what was happening on the streets. I heard my name everywhere. Michael Jennings, war hero, police error. It seemed like the whole world now knew my story, but this wasn't the story I had wanted to tell. The army didn't remain silent. My former comrades, the ones I had fought with through countless battles, began to speak out. Their voices echoed in interviews, statements, and on social platforms. They couldn't believe that a man who had fought for the country could be so unjustly attacked on home soil. Soldiers began to protest. I read the headlines. Military protests for justice. Soldiers' rage. A general they failed to protect. These words resonated deep within me. I felt their support, but I also understood that their anger wasn't just about what had happened to me. This was bigger. Soldiers and officers felt that if even I, a general, could become a victim of such injustice, none of them were safe. They began laying down their weapons, refusing orders, organizing protests. All of this only fueled the fire. Their rage strengthened me, but my anxiety grew. Would they be able to achieve justice in a country that had so easily betrayed one of its own? The police, of course, tried to bury it all. Hunt was suspended, but even that seemed like a formality. A real investigation hadn't even begun, and it increasingly felt like they were trying to sweep the whole thing under the rug. The media started splitting society into two camps, those who supported me and my accomplishments, and those who defended the police, claiming I had provoked the conflict. I knew it was just an attempt to distract, to muddle the situation, but the reality was far darker. Every day felt like a battle, even though I couldn't move. I lay there in the hospital, trying to gather my thoughts, but the news wouldn't leave me in peace. With each passing day, the tension in society grew. The anger of my comrades continued to build, and more civilians joined the protests in our support. Demonstrations were taking place in the streets. This was no longer just the case of General Jennings. It had become a fight for justice, but there were also those who resisted the truth. People who found it convenient to see Officer Hunt not as a murderer, but as a defender of law and order. They claimed that I had brought it on myself, that I had brandished my weapon, that the officer had acted within his authority. It tore me up inside. How could it be that I, someone who had dedicated his life to protecting this country, was now seen as an enemy in the eyes of part of society? At that moment, I realized this fight could drag on for a long time. Then, after several days, news finally reached my bedside. The authorities announced an official investigation. The public pressure had become too strong to ignore, but even that didn't bring me any comfort. I knew how the system worked. They could start an investigation, but what guaranteed its fairness? This was just the first step, and now it wasn't just my reputation at stake, but how I would be remembered by future generations. It all felt like the beginning of a new battle. But this time, I didn't have a weapon in my hands. My new fight was for the truth. The announcement of the investigation was a turning point. Society was split into two camps, and I stood between them, unsure where this would all lead. Months dragged on, each day stretching out in excruciating slowness. I lay in the hospital bed, listening to the rain tapping against the window, constantly aware that life outside was moving forward, while mine had come to a standstill. Each new day was indistinguishable from the one before, and I was growing tired of the wait. My physical wounds were healing, but what hurt more was the growing sense of injustice. I kept up with the news. It was all I had. The media flared up and died down, periodically rehashing my story, while political talk shows debated endlessly about who was right and who was wrong. But no real decisions were being made. Society was demanding punishment for Hunt, but the authorities were slow to act. They were still trying to sweep everything under the rug. It made me sick. I was teetering on the edge of breaking down, often thinking that justice might just be an illusion. Despite public pressure and the military's vocal support, it felt like the system was still turning its back on me, hiding the truth behind layers of bureaucracy. Every time a doctor or nurse came into my room, I searched their faces for answers, hoping they'd bring news. But they were just doing their jobs. I remained alone, with my thoughts, my persistent physical pain, and the deeper emotional wounds. Even if justice prevailed, I knew I'd carry this burden for the rest of my life. But at the same time, I realized that if I didn't see this through, it would destroy me completely. After what felt like an eternity, the news finally came. I overheard a nurse talking to one of the doctors at my door. "They finally fired Hunt," she said, the words cutting through the air like a cold blade, jolting me from a long stupor. My body tensed as I absorbed the information. My heart pounded in my chest. This was the first real step toward justice. Hunt had been fired. I immediately recalled all those moments when I thought the truth would never come out, all those long days when everything seemed hopeless. But now, Hunt was no longer being shielded. His actions had been deemed aggressive and unjustified. For him, it wasn't just the loss of a job. It was an admission that he had been wrong, that his bias and aggression had made him dangerous. Still, the feeling of triumph was bittersweet. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was a signal to everyone who could have been in my place. This case showed that justice could be achieved, but the fight for it was dirty, painful, and long. I understood that for many soldiers, those watching the news right now, it was more than just Hunt's dismissal. It was a glimmer of hope that the system could be corrected. But I also wondered, how deep did the rot of injustice go? A few days later, I left the hospital. My wounds were healing slowly, but I had a sense of moral satisfaction. Coming home felt strange. I was no longer the man I had been when I first returned to civilian life. Now I had a new perspective on the world. A perspective shaped not by the battlefield, but by the heart of the society I had fought to protect. Some time passed after my return home, and one morning I found a package on my doorstep. I opened it to find a box of cereal, the same brand I had been holding when this nightmare began. I laughed. This wasn't just a product, it had become a symbol of how justice could be won if you refused to give up. The box came from the cereal company, along with a letter of support. It read something like, "We know what you've been through. It's just cereal, but we hope it brings you some small joy."